You reach an equal endgame like this, and your opponent offers you a draw. You accept it, because you know that you are either going to draw the game or to lose it. But you don't know that if you were good in the endgame, you would have gained hundreds of points. And I'm not kidding. For example, in my level, we reach the endgame most of the time, and the game is pretty much decided in the endgame. So by knowing the endgames, you are going to win a ton of points, because endgames are really underrated, I would say. And in an equal endgame like this, everyone thinks he's going to draw, but what I think is that I'm going to beat this guy, because I'm pretty good at endgames, and I'm going to teach you how to play the endgame and how to win a drawing one. So, in this position my opponent offered me a draw, and I declined. Is black to move? What can we do? The position is completely equal, I need to create some imbalance, I need to create something. First of all, am I going to take or not? Because if I take the rook, if you think about it, the king is going to take and be closer to the center, so it is not the best idea ever. What I want to do instead is playing the move rook on e6. The idea is that if you take, my king is the one that is going to be closer. That's why you shouldn't probably take, because you allow me to get closer and my king is getting more active. My opponent decided to take. People also tend to play endgames pretty fast because they think, well, this is just a draw, there is no way I can lose it. But you can mess up endgames pretty fast. You need to spend a ton of time in endgames and to think about the best ideas, because every inch you give me is going to be fundamental. So I'm going to take the rook, and my king now is more active. What can we do? The position is almost symmetrical, there is some imbalance on the king side, but it's nothing crazy. My opponent played f3. Now you create a new weakness. As you see, the evaluation bar doesn't love this move because this pawn is weak now, so you might have some problem defending it. I don't think the move knight on h5 is a really good one, because you could just defend the pawn if you think about it. Like, I just play knight on h5, you play something like, I guess, king on f2 because it's closer to the center, and I'm not really going to do anything. At this point I kinda have an idea though, which is to play the move b5, like maybe not now but in the future, because if you think about it, let's say I play b5 and my opponent does nothing, let's say moves the king. I can take, and this could be a weakness. Now, I need to be careful because this is a weakness too. So depending on the positioning of the knight, I can either win a pawn or I can either lose it. So I need to be pretty careful. Instead of doing that, my opponent could also take, but at this point I could make a pass pawn. Okay, let's say, let me do this. At this point I could make a pass pawn if you think about it. I could play this and have a pass pawn. But I also have to be careful because he could have a pass pawn too. He could play a move like this. Now, I'm not sure this is the best move ever, because I could push and this is pretty weak, so this is probably losing. Although I'm just saying this could be an idea, and I need to be careful and think about everything, of course. So going back, b5 is an idea in the future. Right now I don't love it. I would like to have a better positioning of the knight, because the knight on f6 does absolutely nothing. I need to reroute it somewhere. Probably the best square right now, and when you reroute a piece you should think about the best square where you would like it to be, is on d6. So I think I would love to have the knight on d6, so I'm going to play knight on e8 and then knight on d6. Because on d6 I have control of the c4 square, so you cannot push or do dumb stuff. But I could also go on f5 and try to get in with the knight and also attack this weakness. So I played knight on e8, this was the idea, and my opponent is trying to centralize the king, which does make sense indeed. Now, knight on d6, I finally successed on my plan. And now king on e3. Now keep in mind that the move knight on f5 doesn't do a lot, because you could just go back and not going to win the pawn and not going to do anything. At this point I am covering the c4 square one more time, so my opponent doesn't have the idea of making a pass pawn, because in this case I would have the defenders. So I can just play the move b5. b5 is a great move. Not only I'm taking space, but in the future I could use this again in order to make a weakness and win the pawn. So the idea now is then to without the knight and put pressure on the pawn. I don't want to take, I still don't want to take, because if I take, the knight is getting in on the bit square and I need to be pretty careful. If you think about it, let's say this happen, just a random move. Take, either without the knight attacks the pawn, the knight attacks the pawn, you win this, I win this, you win this, I win this. This is a draw with too many pieces. So what I want to do is, first of all, rerouting the knight, but I would also like to get the king closer to the pawn in order to defend it. So, going back, you didn't play this and I play this. Okay, wait, did he actually play this? Oh yeah, he actually did play this. Okay, king on d7. So if this happens, at least I'm not going to lose the pawn. So my opponent has to be pretty careful. You see, endgames are not easy, because if you keep playing too fast, you're going to blunder stuff. I can win this endgame, it's not even that hard if you think about it. You need to be really precise and careful. Now, the king is getting again closer to everything, so this is not a terrible move, I think that does make sense. Now, instead of doing this, because I'm not sure it's going to do anything, I would like to defend this pawn with the king. So let's say I manage to bring the king on b6. I'm not only going to defend the c6 pawn, but also the a5 pawn. So in that case, this idea could be stronger, even though if my king on b6, I'm not going to have a knight there. So king on c7, the king goes on c2. Now, I'm not sure about this move, like, doesn't make any sense. Your king was already really well placed on d3. So there is pretty much no reason to get the king closer to the queen side, because I mean, I'm not getting in anyway. So king on b6. Now this move makes sense for me, because again, I can use this, but I could also try to push this pawn in order to create some weakness. The king goes on b2. Again, another move that doesn't really amaze me, I will say. Now c5 is an idea, but I decided to play the move knight on b8. What is the idea behind this? The idea is that at this point I might even play c5 and then going to take with the knight. This was the idea. The other idea is that I could without the knight on d8 and then play knight on e6, because as you can see, this pawn is weak. If I manage to play knight on e6 actually, and you cannot defend this pawn with the knight, you have to push it, and you are going to have a really miserable structure. So as you see, I am probably the one who is playing for a win in this case. He decided to take. Now, taking is not a great move in my opinion. And not because I can play this and you try to make a pass pawn, which is probably bad. But it is because I can take with the king. If you think about it, after I take with the king, I don't have to do dumb stuff, because this pawn is still defended. So if you play c4, I don't have to take. You see, I don't have to take, because if you take, the pawn is going to take back. So I think taking with the king was a pretty clever move. He actually played this move and I played king on b4. Now I need to be really careful, because he could mate me. Let's say he managed to bring a knight on d3, this would be checkmate. You see? The problem is that he cannot do that. So obviously before playing this move, I checked all the way he could have done that, but there isn't a really clear way to do that. I mean, how are you going to without the knight there? It's not even that simple. I can't even think about a way, to be fair. Let me think. This. But I mean, it's going to take a ton of moves. So it is not the best idea ever to mate me in that case. I can definitely do something. Also keep in mind that if I push this pawn, I have the a5 square anytime I want. So he decided to move the king, and now the position is suddenly completely lost. How can it be completely lost though? Because if I take, doesn't do too much. If I push this pawn, you can take. My king is kind of far from the center. So I think there are two ways. Well, Stockfish is suggesting to play the move knight on d6, which does make sense. But I decided to play the move knight on d8, which is still pretty good and still winning. The idea is that after you push this pawn, not only this is weak now, but this is also weak. So by playing knight on e6, I can win a pawn. You have to be really careful at this point. It's not an easy position to play. He decided to play king on d3, which does make sense, but now how are you going to defend everything? Because after they play the move knight on e6, not only this pawn is hanging, after you defend it, you forgot about something. My king is a really strong king right now, and the idea of putting the king on before was that if you move the king too far, I'm going to get in your position, and there is nothing you can do about that. So now the move king on c3 is suddenly winning, because I have, for example, the tactic, let's say, to take this, king take, and then win the knight, for example. But also, I'm putting pressure on all of these pawns. This pawn is super weak, and I could manage, maybe, there are high chance, to be fair, to create a pass pawn. At this point, I would like you to pay attention at the time. I have 2 minutes. I think we started with 6 and something. Let me see. We started... Okay, let me get to the endgame maybe. Let me get to the endgame. Okay, it's this. I had 7 minutes and also my opponent. So move 40. I have 2 minutes. My opponent 5. So he spent less than 2 minutes. I spent 5 minutes. And what happens is that this position is -6. You didn't take this endgame too serious because you thought it was an easy draw. The reality is that it wasn't. And now it is completely lost. This is what I'm talking about when I say you can win hundreds of points in the endgame, because almost no one can play them. Like, people think they are kinda easy. You can play fast move, it is a draw. It is never a draw. Even in opposite color bishop endgames, it's not that simple. It's actually not that simple. You could also win them. So he decided to take. This move doesn't do a lot. And by the way, I forgot to mention that I could win this pawn now, for example. It is totally free. So I decided to take. Obviously, it has to be the best move. I'm covering all these important squares. This pawn is a monster. I'm happy with the d5 pawn. Like, absolutely no problem. He decided to push. Obviously, we can take. We are not scared about anything at this point. Now you have a miserable pawn structure, and not also that. This pawn is pretty weak, and my king is way better than yours. Now, can I take this pawn? The truth is that I can't. Because if I play this... Okay, I thought it was losing, but you could give me a check. I have to move somewhere, I'm going to lose the knight, so king on b2, and you win this. I take the knight and you win this. Okay, in this case it's completely winning for me. But I mean, I thought it was pretty difficult to play. I wasn't sure about that. But Stockfish agrees with me, so maybe there is something else to play. But no, now that he thinks about it, knight takes d4 is the best move. Although I was scared about all of this, and my idea was I'm going to win the pawn anyway. Like, this position is so good that instead of risking it, I could just redraw the knight, then to target these pawns, because all of these pawns are super weak. This king is not going to defend this, obviously. This king is a monster. So I don't have to risk anything. I could just redraw the knight, wait till I win the pawn, giving my opponent 0 counterplay. So anyway, even if it wasn't the best move, practically speaking, it is the most clever, because your opponent is not going to have anything, and you don't have to calculate all the dumb stuff. So, knight on c7, pawn on f4, a move that I don't really like. Your idea is to redraw the knight, but I also have the idea of f6, preventing everything, and if you move the knight, I'm going to win the pawn, so keep that in mind. And now, knight on b4, this pawn could be won. He decided to play knight on f3, so now this pawn is free, but be careful, before giving your opponent counterplay, just play a defensive move. Like, there is no need to win this pawn and give your opponent the chance to do something good or to even win the game. Instead of winning this pawn, because we are either going to win this or this if he moves the knight, then to defend a bit the pawn. we could just play f6. With the move f6, I'm doing two things. First of all, your knight is not going anywhere. Second, this pawn now is blocked. So I could also play knight on d6 and win it. This is way better than just winning the pawn. Now, in this case, I decided to develop the knight because, again, there is still the same idea. I don't want to calculate everything. It is risky. I could miss something and lose the game. Now there is nothing to calculate. There is literally no way to defend the pawn. This is how you should play an endgame, in my opinion, because, as you see, my opponent has absolutely zero counterplay and I'm going to win everything without having any problem. So, I took the pawn. Obviously, now there is nothing he can do. Like, he gave me a free pawn in this case. Okay, now his king is more active, but I don't really care. I have a pass pawn and I'm up 2 pawns, which is, you know, pretty good. Now, instead of pushing, again, before doing everything, just defend. You can defend. You can absolutely defend. There is no problem. In this case, it's time to push because the knight has to be close to the pawn. Otherwise, I'm going to make a queen. In this case, our opponent gives us this really good square, so we can attack the knight, taking control of more space and eventually win the pawn. The knight gives a check. We have absolutely zero problem. In this case, you cannot play knight on f5 winning the pawn. We add up the pawns and we have to pass one. My opponent played knight on e8, and instead of pushing, once again, we can defend all the position without having any problem. Knight on f5. And we're still up the pawns. So as you see, before going for your plan, defend, giving your opponent zero counterplay. This is really important. So it tries to get to the pawn. Now it is kinda useless to defend this pawn. My knight and my king are really far from it. So we can try, for example, to make a queen with this one or to win this pawn. So I decided to play king on e4. And now we can push it with zero problems. We win the pawn. Now we are up 4 pawns. I guess it is enough to win. We defend the pawn. And we're going to make a queen pretty soon. Now be careful, because if we push, it's going to give a check and win it. So we can prevent that idea by playing knight on d6. As you see, I'm coordinating all of my pieces in order to give my opponent zero play, defend everything, and slowly going to win the game. Decided to give me a check anyway. Now obviously we are up 4 pawns, so we can definitely take it. King take, and we are going to make a queen. Now my opponent kept playing. I obviously won the game. I'll show you how I won, because I didn't have a ton of time. There is a chance you could draw this game for stalemate. So instead of making a new queen, I'm just going to take some space with this one, which is the safest way to win. So now we cut off the king. This is the perfect position for the queen, because at this point the king can only go on 2 squares. He can just shuffle. So in the meanwhile, we can move the king. You can pretty much remove all of this move. You just need the queen on this square, and you are going to meet your opponent. So this is how you can win without, you know, being scared about stalemate ideas. So that's it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any suggestion or question, please let me know in the comment, and I'll see you soon in the next video.